Good morning. This is Laura Cifiri, founder of Supply Chain Insights. I want to welcome you to our conference and webinar today on becoming demand-driven and where we are in the evolution of these processes. Today I'm joined by a wonderful panel, and we're going to talk today about where we are on demand-driven. So, Regina, if you want to advance the slides for me, we're having a little bit of trouble here. We can continue to advance here. I'll just give you the cues. So I'm joined today by people that I've worked with over many years in the journey of demand-driven. First of all, I want to introduce Steve Vielmetti. Steve, tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me today. Yeah, this is Steve Vielmetti. I've been working in the supply chain for most of my career, and first met Laura probably 15 or 20 years ago while I was at Clorox. And through my spent time across the supply chain, multiple different areas, demand planning, strategy, most recently with Johnson Controls, helping with both some supply chain transformation as well as some M&A work that they're doing.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for joining. One of the reasons why I wanted Steve to join is because he covers so many industries. Many times people think the concept of demand-driven only apply to consumer packaged goods or to retail, and Steve has had his feet firmly in consumer packaged goods in the discrete space, and I always find Steve to be a great visionary. Next, let me introduce Roddy Martin. Roddy Martin and I work together at AMR Research. We had long debates on the evolution of research of demand-driven. Roddy, we'll skip some of that color, but tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Skip the color. This is Roddy Martin. I'm a partner with Accenture Strategy, focusing on supply chain transformation. And as Laura said, we were together for many years at AMR where we formulated the base of demand-driven research that's become very exciting. And in the days when we started, it was about consumer electronics, goods and retail. Today, even the big industrial manufacturers are talking about their demand-driven transformation and digital supply networks. So this is an exciting space. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Roddy. Now, Rick Davis is one of my favorites to talk about demand-driven. I find Rick to have great insights about the value of demand-driven. Rick sits in the sales organization within Kellogg, and many times the supply chain group has difficulty crossing the operations to sales boundary. So I invited Rick to talk today and give his perspective. Rick, share a little bit about your background.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Spent the last 25 years with the Kellogg organization in a number of different functions. Started in the sales organization, moved through distribution, logistics, back into sales. And I've had a number of the functions which are critical to this process. So demand planning, and then the understanding of the commercial side of that planning operation as well. So anxious to get started and be a part of this and learn from the rest of the panel as well as share a few thoughts. So thank you.
And so, Rick, how long has Kellogg been on a demand-driven journey, or would you consider yourself on one today?
That's a really good question. There are days I feel like we're very much on the journey, and then some days I feel like we're backing up to get a running start. It's absolutely a journey. I know that we probably started having conversations about how we do it better and get away from this perfect forecast mentality, I think, 7, 8, 9 years ago, about the time you and I met, Laura. And we've made some inroads. We still have a long way to go, and I look forward to talking about it.
And next, I want to introduce Carol Ptak. Carol has actually been one of the founders of the Demand Driven Institute, and I first met Carol when I worked for Gartner Group. Carol was at PeopleSoft and doing a lot of work around how do we make material purchases based upon independent demand, and she's been a thought leader on demand driven, particularly for MRP. So, Carol, tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks, Laura. I sure appreciate the invitation to be here with this rest of this panel today. I started out on the manufacturing shop floor at minimum wage, and as you said, worked my way up to being Vice President, Global Industry Executive for PeopleSoft, in charge of all the manufacturing and distribution strategy, where we coined that term demand-driven manufacturing as the direction that PeopleSoft was going to take. So my background with it is it's really been working with a number of practitioners, both as a practitioner myself and as a consultant and through the software industry, to figure out exactly how do we do this demand-driven thing. As Rick said, it's not about the perfect forecast, because let's face it, there is no perfect forecast.
Right, and many times people mistakenly think demand-driven starts with the forecast. But anyway, as we think about this panel, I deliberately picked two industry visionaries who are working hands-on in industry, Rick and Steve. Roddy, who was a compatriot for me at AMR and continues to work in the consulting organization, and Carol, who's done a lot of research around materials, so that we can step back and say, where are we on this demand-driven journey? I'm going to present some slides to set some context, and as we go along in the spirit of our ongoing webinars at Supply Chain Insights, I'm going to engage the panel with the evolution of demand-driven and where are we. Sometimes people think that the concepts demand-driven are pretty academic and they're hard to implement. Maybe some even question what is the return on investment, and we're going to try to get to some of those questions. So, Regina, if we can go to the next slide, and we're going to actually push through here. So the traditional supply chain, and I actually borrowed this slide from Kimberly Clark, was all about shipping. And as we think about going to the shelf, one of the reasons why we need to focus on the shelf is that the supply chain today has a longer tail. And many of the products on the long tail of the supply chain are heavily promoted, or they're new products, and they're really the engine of growth. But what happens is, because our traditional systems are based upon orders and shipments, and there's latency associated with orders and shipments, many consumer packaged goods companies find themselves in this conundrum. They've paid a lot of money for this space, and the space is empty. You can see here this is actually buy one, get one free promotion, very costly, and the space is empty. And in fact, we don't get a lot of shelf space for our products because of the expansion of the product life cycle. So really getting at demand latency, because the latency of the order is increased, and really being able to reduce demand latency is extremely important for growth. Regina, next slide. Now, as we think about demand latency, it is the time to translate actual demand to the order, and many times people don't think about that. And we've made it more difficult because we've made the supply chain organization a function. It often will sit by itself, and it will be in isolation of sales. And there are often issues with the group that's called the supply chain, which is often logistics or distribution. And often procurement's in a separate silo, and manufacturing can be in a separate silo working together. And the concepts of demand latency and demand translation are new concepts, and the supply chain organization is a function. And so driving this kind of change is difficult because the traditional processes are inside out. They're not outside in. What do I mean by that? Well, the traditional processes are based upon orders and shipments, and demand-driven is outside in. Next slide, Regina. And so this term supply chain means many different things, but the conundrum is that the long tail of the supply chain is growing. We have growing complexity. In consumer packaged goods, we've increased the number of items by 38% over the last 5 years. And in the discrete industries, we have shorter life cycles, and in apparel, we've got a proliferation of attributes and channels, and as we have the rise of e-commerce, this concept of the long tail is really difficult in our traditional systems that are based upon orders and shipments. And what happens is the long tail actually whips the supply chain around. So the concept of becoming demand-driven has grown more important, but the ability to get there has become more of an issue. Next slide, Regina. And so as we think about, growing complexity and we think about the long tail, go back one slide, Regina. What we've had is the evolution of the definitions of demand-driven. Next slide, Regina. And we've actually seen that we first started with the definition of consumer-driven supply networks, which was really defined by Procter & Gamble in the 1990s, and that's what Roddy and I started working with. And then we published in 2004 the concept around the demand-driven supply chain or demand-driven supply network, and then we modified it in 2007 for the demand-driven value network, which was really to look at a network. And then recently I've been doing a lot of writing, and the last 2 books I've written around market-driven value networks. The principal differences are that we've gone from chains to networks, and we've gone from outside in on the demand side to the market-driven concept actually says that we're going to orchestrate market to market from sales to procurement and back in horizontal processes based upon things like alternate bills of material, alternate sourcing, alternate promotion plans. So let's kind of step back here. Carol, how do you define demand-driven, and how do you feel about the evolution here?
Well, and I think it has been an evolution, and I think the biggest part of the evolution was this idea of instead of focusing from inside out, of establishing what I can build and when, to saying what does my customer want and when. And I think what demand-driven is really all about is really back to the same definition as we used in PeopleSoft when we introduced the concept of demand-driven manufacturing back in 2003, which is that ability to sense and adapt to changing customer demands and then be able to adapt our supply chain in real time to be able to react to that. It's not about having a better forecast, because even if we can improve forecasts, we just don't see the improvement in the overall operation of the supply chain because of the requirement for all these pieces of synchronization that come together across the supply chain. So to me, it's all about being able to sense and adapt.
And Roddy, how about yourself? I mean, you've been part of this evolution. When you step back and you think about the definition, what's your takeaway? What would you share with the audience?
Yeah, so Laura, if you remember when we went back in the early days and we called this demand-driven supply chain, what we realized was that a lot of companies, their mental model was how fast can I respond to something happening on the shelf, and that's why we changed it to the outside-in value network, because it's all about value to the consumer. So at the ultimate, and this is why the digital value chain, the digitized value network is such a fundamental add. It's about the ability to sense what's happening in the market at the point at which a buyer is buying, and be able to get the insights from big data and data mining to understand what do I need to do to shape demand. And I think those are the very fundamental principles of being demand-driven. Of course, agility on the supply side of the business, being able to respond to changes in market demand is fundamental, and that's a big challenge to the product supply network with its contract manufacturers and acquisitions that have happened over years.
So Rick, let's shift the ball to you. You've been kind of a consumer of this research. What does demand-driven mean to you, and why is it important?
Well, I think that there are a lot of common definitions we probably could all accept. The understanding that it's outside in, it's responding to the shelf, it's building in the flexibility and the agility to respond. But for me, being demand-driven starts with making the strategic choice that you're going to operate that way. It's a philosophy. It's much more about the way the organization is willing to come together and work cross-functionally to to make sure that the consumer and shopper is, that delighting the consumer and shopper is the ultimate goal, and that everything we do is going to be critically designed to do just that. And that's why I think it's so hard. Anyone can agree that it makes all the sense in the world to be more responsive and to even understand demand. But the organization coming together philosophically to agree that you're going to operate that way cross-functionally, and that you're not going to continue to spend your time. I love Carol's comment, the perfect forecast. That you're not going to spend your time trying to do that, because there are just too many market variables. That's not going to happen, and that takes a big mindset shift for an organization to really take this journey seriously.
But why is it important, Rick? I mean, why can't we not just run with inside-out processes? People say to me, what's the value proposition? Why do I want to do it?
Well, I think that's because we're always in conflict with our inside-out processes. It's so difficult to get the metrics aligned. The supply chains of old with the big, long production runs and the cost-driven focus, versus, the sales or the marketing organization that might be customer-focused or consumer-focused, or hopefully both. It's so hard to get alignment until you get that common goal, that common intent, because inside-out processes, it takes a complete revamping of the way the metrics and incentives work to get them all working together. And once you do that, I actually think you have the opportunity to become demand-driven.
So, Steve, let me turn to you. Now, you've also been a customer of this research. I know I've worked with you over probably 7 years on the concepts. As you step and you look at, the changing definitions, what does demand-driven mean to you, and why is it important?
Sure, Laura. So, as I think about demand-driven, I might expand it somewhat beyond what we've talked a little bit, in the sense of when I really say if you have a demand-driven organization, I think you have happy customers or good relationships with your customers. You're maximizing your profit and you're minimizing waste, and that's maybe nirvana. But when I think of demand-driven, I think of how do you leverage the predictable part of your demand signal. So you can improve your forecasts in certain areas. How does that core of the business that's predictable help you to fuel growth or support some of the unpredictable elements of the business? How do you leverage those signals in those areas where there is unpredictability, or you have opportunity to capture more growth or more volume or more profit, and drive some of the waste out of the system through better visibility to what's going on? I've seen the concepts applied in the food industry. You're trying to avoid expiration dates, or you're trying to avoid that hole on the shelf. Car batteries, you need to be there for the cold weather. On the flip side, you need to avoid having those batteries run out of charge on the shelf and need to be refreshed. So there's the balance there. How do you kind of leverage what you know and what you can see to maximize the performance? You see it in electronics. You've seen it in music. In the old days, back before digital music, new release day of Tuesday is how do you ensure that you get the Garth Brooks or the other new CD on the shelf without loading up the store so much if they don't want that. And I've seen demand-driven applied, the balance of how do you leverage the history, how do you leverage your knowledge of a store or a consumer, with how do you respond quickly to capture what you don't know, or that uncertainty portion of the demand.
Yeah, and most people don't think about demand latency as waste, or the translation to waste. And, why is this so hard, Steve?
I think it requires people to shift gears at times, or all product is not created equal. And when you really get good at demand driven, it drives your plants to operate differently. Maybe there's a portion of the plant that's supporting very predictable demand and is touching the product as few times as needed between the point of production and the point of getting to the shelf. There may be other cases where you're loading inventory or managing semi-finished goods to allow you to respond quickly. But the challenge is that all of those models aren't the same, and if you have, say, a plant manager or a merchandise manager at a retailer, getting them to be able to shift gears and think about the different portions of their business differently can be a challenge. People like things to be simple, and I believe that really being demand-driven requires adding some complexity in certain areas to really capture that value that's out there.
So,
no,
Laura, if I could just add something into what Rick's, because I think Rick's point about the mental model is really important. I mean, becoming demand-driven means changing the business operating model. That's not an easy job if you're doing it bottom-up. It's easier if you have strong leadership, like we saw back when A.J. Lafley drove the Procter & Gamble strategy, and you now see a lot of companies follow. It's that top-down leadership changing the way the business operates.
Right. Now, Carol, sometimes people will say, well, the concepts of demand-driven only apply for consumer packaged goods. They don't apply for discrete industries. And I know you've done a lot of work around independent versus dependent demand. What do you think? Does it apply to discrete industries?
I've seen companies from, high-volume consumer goods, which we would expect because of the speed of the market, all the way to companies that never see inventory, that are absolutely unique, build one-offs, have the same kind of transformation occur in their organization. Companies that build oil drilling platforms, as they become demand-driven, to reduce their lead time to the marketplace from 18 months to 18 weeks. To another company that never produces anything the same, a pure engineer to order, and having that ability, as Roddy said, it's about changing the strategy of how do you manage your company, how it is that you're going to take it to market. And so I think it fits up and down the entire volume variety matrix, from very high volume, low volume to high variety, low volume. So it's a fit across, but it's not just a benefit to the customer. I would challenge that if you truly are demand-driven, there's also a value to the supplier, because to become demand-driven, you have to be able to manage that variability, that bullwhip effect. And when you can do that, you're benefiting both the customer with a more reliable supply signal, but you're also benefiting the supplier with a more reliable demand signal, so that you quit whiplashing your suppliers around.
Well, and that's so important as we're dealing with very fragile supply bases today and tight transportation. Regina, let's go on with the slides. So we've grounded in that there are lots of definitions of demand-driven. We also grounded in that it's a multi-year journey, and it is driven by the speed of the leadership and also somewhat the size of the organization. Kimberly-Clark spoke at a recent conference that we did, and this was the Kimberly-Clark journey. What I want you to do is really understand they're not done. They started in 2005. It's still evolving, and it's many projects, and the push to go outside in really requires the redefinition of cross-functional processes and organizations. And so this is a typical journey of many, many years with many projects. Next slide. And as we think about what that looks like, what people really come to understand is that they have multiple demand signals, and that they've got to really synchronize and harmonize the demand signal. It isn't just about integration, because the offset of shelf takeaway and consumer packaged goods versus shipments, or the translation of demand into dependent demand, goes through this bullwhip effect. And so the latency and the translation issues of translating that across the organization is not trivial. Next slide. And so as we think about this evolution of aligning demand patterns, this is an example of a pharmaceutical company, and you can see that the black bars are representative of the forecast, and the individual lines are representative of geographic regions that are responding to issues with a particular allergy. And you can see that that demand pattern is very regional, and so every industry has different rhythms and cycles, and it's about multiple demand signals, and it's about outside in, and it's about harmonization and synchronization. Next slide. And so demand is not easy. And most of the organizations have built very supply-centered cultures, and we've built traditional supply chain planning systems. So let me just ask you a question. Rick, with ERP and the current forms of APS, do you think we can make these systems demand-driven?
I think there's probably opportunities to improve, but I don't think that the systems are necessarily the problem. Again, I would revert back a bit to what we said before. Companies become very set in their ways, and they become very focused on their own functional goals. So what's happened is that it's not that the systems don't work, it's that the integration of systems and the analytics looking across the different systems aren't necessarily integrated in a fashion which allows you to see that whole end-to-end process. I can only speak for our organization, but with the individuals that I've spoke with, I think this is one of our biggest challenges that we've got with systems today.
Is it because we don't start with outside in as the design?
Well, I think that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Or is it the cross-functional issues that we have between functions?
My perspective would be the lack of alignment across the functions, because once again, it started with that mindset that said we were going to work to a common goal.
Roddy, what do you think? Can we get there with today's systems? And if so, is it because we don't start with outside in as a goal, or is it because we don't have cross-functional alignment? What's your perspective?
So, Laura, companies have spent the last 5-8 years deploying transactionally focused ERP systems, and those are necessary to run the business. And one can always do better integration, put some overarching processes in place to tie systems together. What we're seeing is that the advent of this whole notion of control towers, which is a cloud-based layer that effectively enables the digital value network, but which ties into all of these systems investments that we've made. I think there's a bigger challenge, though, and it's not the systems infrastructure that we've created or new technologies that bring together people, process, and technology to become outside-in driven. I think it's the stage of maturity of organizations, and we've all seen the 5-stage maturity model, which we use at Accenture as well, which basically says, if you're in stage 2, you're thinking about performance improvement in projects, and 3, you're in functional excellence, and 4, you're in end-to-end. Most companies, and I did this research when I was at AMR and Gartner, most companies are still in stage 2. They're still focused on project-based performance improvement, and so therefore we've got silos of metrics across the business. And then to the point of not having the necessary cross-functional alignment means that you've got way too many metrics without a systematic and a systemic understanding of how those metrics are connected and how they're connected to, customer satisfaction, account profitability, service levels, on-shelf availability, and all the numbers that we now need to look at as metrics representing your demand-driven capabilities. So I think the long and the short of my answer is it's not the systems we put in place. We didn't know necessarily about demand-driven when companies were trying to rationalize their systems infrastructure and put ERP in place. It's not the ERP system's fault. It's we need this overarching process layer that will allow us to connect, to collaborate, to move information. We have an architecture in Accenture that a control tower architecture is really about visibility, analytics, and execution. I still need all that transactional infrastructure to execute and to some extent to get visibility of the transactions that I'm affecting in the business. So I think it's about looking at the business operating model, the enterprise architecture, taking the systems and investments, the data we have in place, and looking to see what people, process, and technology changes we need to make. And this is where the digital value network is going. This is where digitization of the end-to-end business is such a powerful concept.
Yeah, and this is where we agree to disagree, Roddy. I just think that most of our systems have been implemented inside out, and it requires a redesign. But Carol, what do you think?
Well, I agree and I disagree. I think that there are some inherent assumptions and the way our systems were put together, that the more tightly we couple those systems to other positions of the supply chain, that dependency is actually what's causing the bullwhip effect. Because any small disruption, what we know is the more tightly linked we put operations or links in the supply chain or anything else. And it's a proven mathematical model that we've known about since the early 1960s called the Forrester effect. So the more tightly we couple, the good news is we get faster information. The bad news is that any small disruption then really increases as you move through that. So it's not coincidental that MRP was invented in the 50s and Forrester started his writings around what we now call the bullwhip effect in 1961. So it's that dependency is sort of the good news and the bad news. Today we have more dependencies across our supply chain than ever before, but so we need some kind of a management system to be able to handle that, but we need a different form that's based on a different set of assumptions and models than what we have in the systems today. So I think the systems that we have today aren't going to do it because they were really based on an environment that doesn't exist anymore. And today things just have to be so much faster, and we have to be able to manage that variability bullwhip effect because we're never going to get rid of it. The best we can do is management and how do we decouple that bullwhip and prevent it from being whiplashed through the supply chain.
Yeah, part of the research that I'm doing is that, we only have 1% of companies that have anyone looking end to end, and that, the supply chain has been managed by linear optimization, and it's a nonlinear complex system, and that, we've tightly coupled if-then statements that really need multiple ifs and multiple thens and more contextual data. So I think we need a transactional system and elements of what we put in, but I think the market is open and ready to shift. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm probably on both sides of the fence here. I've seen some great software implemented in different cases. I've also seen some very simple, elegant solutions that have really helped drive that connectivity in the organization. One that we worked on at ConAgra, when I started there leading demand planning, we had a sales forecast and we had our demand plan. And when I sat down with Doug Knudsen, who at the time ran the sales organization at ConAgra, I told him, I thought that we could probably just eliminate the sales forecast. I said I would ask for something in response, to replace it. But he looked at me like, "Are you kidding me? We spent hours on this." The reality was, the sales forecast was really not the input that was needed to help run the supply chain. What we needed were their events, and we created a very simple tool that allowed the demand planners to capture major promotional activity that was planned at a fairly detailed level to help support getting a signal into the supply chain that could support that event. On the other side of the spectrum, when we were starting to look at using some POS analytic tools like an RSI or that type of tool, we talked about how do we deliver some of those insights to the field merchandiser to help them influence what was going on at the store. So, one of the key things that I've seen in demand driven is it's only as good as the quality of the inputs. And many organizations have put in systems but have not focused on data governance and making sure that the data going in was effective. I think the other side of it was, how do you deliver the exception reports or the insights in a simple way that doesn't require adding a whole new concept of what the roles are for these people in the organization. So I absolutely believe the systems are core to this. I don't know that there's a stomach to continue to develop new systems. A lot of it's around how do we weave them together, how do we drive those specific insights out of them to help drive action back to happy customers, maximizing profit throughout the value chain, and then minimizing the waste.
So, Roddy, I sense that you've got some thoughts here.
Yeah, I think, the point is, if in a very simple sense, we put a lot of systems in place to drive, integration of functions and functional excellence. And the paradigm, and it sort of touches on the point that Carol made, the paradigm was collect all this data, try and figure out what the forecast is, and then let's make to a forecast. And the reality is that the market is so volatile. I mean, just have a look at what's happening with the oil price. The market is so volatile that costing changes fundamentally overnight. Demand can change as a result of an event. So I think the big opportunity here is it's not about blaming the transaction system. We've still got to execute the transactions, but we need to give that transactional processing a much better view of what's actually happening in the market, and then build an agile business operating model around making that happen profitably for the business and meeting the service levels and all the product launch goals, et cetera. And that's the real challenge.
Right. And I think we're at an inflection point around technologies and processes as technologies grow and capabilities, as organizations come to greater understanding. Let's go on with the slides here. I think one of the issues is that most of the supply chains have been put in as projects or functions. People lack a person that's really overarching, designing end-to-end processes. Most companies have implemented order and shipment data, and they really don't have channel data. So, Rick, as you think about it, what have you learned, and who do you think does it well? And what would you think that people should take away from this webinar?
Oh, well, that's a lot of questions in one. Well, I think that there are a number of CPG companies who are at different levels of maturity, as if you're talking about who's doing this well. But I think it's very helpful to look outside of the industry that we sit in. I love the statement that when we're talking, we're sharing what we know, but when we're listening, we're actually learning. And try to look at other industries and borrow from them where they're doing it well. And I think about the airlines and what they've been able to do with some, talking about volatility, just amazing. And I don't think that you can do this well without investing in the analytics capability and having the right people asking those questions and being able to look for those answers. It's not just data. It's not just mindset. You actually have to want to do this. I think that you have to embed that capability of analytics to look over the top of this and really seize the value. Because as I said a moment ago, there are so many variables in the marketplace. And for me, outside in means that we're recognizing the variability that's in the marketplace. We're actually understanding that and doing everything we can to try to gain insights from that. So I think the airlines have done a very nice job of moving along this curve. I love to think about what Steve Jobs and Apple did. I mean, talk about being externally focused and market-driven, changed the world. So what I've learned is that this is an opportunity for organizations to change their game. It's not easy to do. It's very difficult. It requires leadership from the top. You have to make the conscious choice that you're going to do this and understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. You have to look at a number of other disciplines to make this work. But it's a fascinating space.
Carol, what do you think? Who does it well, and what have you learned that you could share as kind of next steps for people?
Well, I think one of the biggest companies that's embraced demand-driven is Unilever, where they've taken the response time for the marketplace from 50 days down to 3 days, which has put them into a whole different kind of competitive position. But also it's medium-sized companies as well, like Tube Forgings just outside of Portland, that, these guys were able to sense the crash in 2008 where half of their volume went away, and where their competitors were trying to figure out how to stock things in a make-to-order environment. They were able to adapt that supply chain so that they were able to be more responsive to their customers. And they not only survived that incredible, gut-wrenching drop that they saw where half of their business went away, but they never laid a single person off. And most importantly, they stayed profitable through that entire incredible volatility. And now they're growing like crazy. This is a make-to-order company with lead times of raw materials coming in months and customers expecting custom products in days. So I think they're at both ends of the spectrum, from a make-to-stock to a make-to-order or engineer-to-order company. And so I think it's about changing what we think. And you touched on it earlier, Laura, about the supply chain is not fractal. It is not about trying to find an optimization point. A supply chain is a complex, adaptive system where it's the power of understanding that supply chain is in those interconnectedness, and that's how you affect that whole supply chain.
Yeah, and it's a different level of thinking. What was the name of the company again, Carol? Your voice dropped.
Oh, sorry. The one down in Portland is called Tube Forging.
Okay, awesome. Steve, what do you think? Who do you think does it well, and what would you leave the audience with?
Yeah, and I think about demand-driven. I mean, there are a couple models out there that are. You think about package delivery, and that goes back a long way. But the number of options someone has, and to be, the payment. If you want it tomorrow, you pay a lot. If you're willing to wait, you pay less, and it's really an on-demand option for you. That's kind of one concept. And I think about even banking, and how many of us on this call today have been to a branch bank in the last year. I know my visits have dropped dramatically, first with just being able to manage my account with my phone, and then now with being able to deposit checks. You find that you think about true demand-driven, what's taken out of the network, the supply chain required to manage your banking. You're not driving to the store. You've got it real time. You don't have to worry about the hours that the place is open. So I think of those kinds of models, and then you get into the actual manufacturing of goods. There are folks out there who have done it extraordinarily well, have continued to push the envelope. Procter & Gamble you can't ignore because they've started a lot of this. I think there are a lot of things that companies are doing that we don't hear about, we don't talk about, because people are good at it, and they're not talking about it because it's what's giving them a competitive advantage in the market. And when you look at the number of small companies that are doing software, and when you look at some of the software, you go, that's pretty cool. Why isn't everyone using it? It's hard to overcome the inertia in organizations and getting people to change behaviors required to really drive or capture the value that's there. So
right.
It's a long journey. It requires different thinking. It requires patience at times, and then it requires taking risk. People, companies, individuals need to take risk, but it can be a lot of fun. I mean, you start to see the impact, and in some cases how easily some of these things can be done. It's a lot of fun. When you're part of it, and you're part of the transformation involved with a demand-driven concept or organization, you can get a lot done very quickly, and your customers notice, and your employees notice because they're spending the time on the right things, and it drives value into the organization.
Awesome. So, Roddy, who do you think does it well, and what pieces of advice would you leave with the audience?
So I think those two questions have a couple of common answers. So number one, I think who does it well is the consumer-facing companies, because they have to deal with the difficulty of market demand and of changing circumstances in expendable income, etc. So, of course, the consumer goods companies, like the Procter & Gamble's, were legendary when we researched this back at AMR. But you look at the FedExes and the distribution companies, the Amazons of the world. I mean, they've all had to sense and respond very quickly to change. So when we came to apply the model to the pharmaceutical industry and the big industrial companies, they said, well, no, we just have 300 days worth of inventory, and that's how we manage changes in demand. Or the industrials would say, configure or build to order business, and demand doesn't change that quickly. I think what I learned out of that process, when you take a step back, is that it's not about one supply chain. No company has one supply chain. We're just too big, we're too global to oversimplify and optimize against one supply chain. We have 4 or 5, maybe even 6, 7 supply chains. Some of them are going to be very high volume, very predictable. some of them are going to be low volume and unpredictable because we may have launched a new product or service. So I think what I've also learned is that segmentation and a segmented demand-driven view of the market translated back into a segmented capability to deliver is a very fundamental learning. Second point that I made, and I want to emphasize again to Rick's point, and that is this is a fundamental change to the operating model of the business, and it has to be led from the leadership team down. It will involve, it's a journey, and it will involve people, organization, talent change, systems change, process changes. So that's a very fundamental journey that a company has to embark on. So don't underestimate change management as a big portion of the journey and the transformation to demand-driven. And I think, I want to call out here technology in particular, because I do think that a lot of the challenges that we had was we'd invested so much time and effort into integrating transactional systems that now that we have these cloud-based opportunities to put in control towers and we can build process scenarios for things like supplier risk management and things like sales and operations planning. The digitized value network now gives us a really great opportunity to leverage that transactional infrastructure, but to build the outside-in processes, not to go in and change all the infrastructure that we've put in years. Yes, we may have to make some changes. We don't have to throw it away, and we don't have to redo it all. So the technological change, but I do think that brings about the challenge of the IT organization and the supply chain and the business organization working very closely together. Those companies that have been successful is where I've seen IT, supply chain, the business working hand in hand to bring about these new capabilities, because they are new capabilities. And I think it's very exciting because those companies that went down the road of transforming, and I mean there are many examples. There's the Apples, the Amazons, the Procter & Gamble's, all well-published public domain companies. The companies that have been successful have seen the benefits, but they haven't got to the end of the journey. This is not something that starts and finishes, because as we've seen with the digitized value network, it's morphing into an even newer set of capabilities. Think about what big data potentially does for us as we mine social media and look for patterns, things people are saying about our products and services. We've got to be quick and agile enough to respond to that. And that's the change to the business operating model that I think I've learned is the fundamental underpinning of the success stories.
Well, I want to thank the panel, and Regina, if we can move the slides forward. What I've learned is that the definition of demand-driven has evolved over the period. No one company has it all figured out. We have lots of new business models, lots of new technologies evolving, and we do plan to showcase some of this in terms of new business processes at our Global Summit, which will be happening on September 9th and 10th. We'll be talking about things like, does Uber redefine the automotive industry? The green supply chain, what does it take to drive this kind of cultural definition? We want to be sure that everyone is able to mark their calendars. And we will be doing webinars monthly on a countdown of new technologies and new processes. And as always, our format is to take the research and to ask industry experts to voice their opinion. We're also doing some research on how happy are current supply chain leaders with existing technology. It's our Voice of Supply Chain report. It's our fourth year of the tracking study around what are people spending money on and where are people happy and where are they having dissatisfaction. We also have our podcast series. Next week we'll be launching our New Year's resolution podcast. Today we have about 110 podcasts that are archived on iTunes and Stitcher if you want to hear the voice of the supply chain leader to get their flair and what's happening. And so as you think about this journey, we want to be there with you. And we want to help you because there's no one right answer. I think we're at an inflection point where we have new technologies, new capabilities, and supply chain matters more than ever. It's fundamental for growth, It's fundamental for managing cost, and it's fundamental for driving service. This is Laura Ciceri. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to the panel, and good luck with your supply chain journey. Thank you.